Hey everyone, my latest interview was with Sharon Lo, who's a product lead at GitHub Copilot. Just like with these other interviews, I want to summarize the different topics we have. These are in order. We largely talked about AI since she works at Copilot and her thoughts on mental health in the tech industry. I think it was a great conversation. I really hope you enjoy the video.
Hi.
Okay, let's do a quick audio test chat. Can you hear Sharon? Sharon, you want to tell me what you had for lunch today?
I had like sad leftovers.
Sad
Is
leftovers.
my background better? I can't fully see what is visible.
Yeah,
I kind of just put things around. Okay,
it's
cool.
good. And I have you slightly cut off because of what we talked about earlier. I can move you a little to the side here. Yeah.
Perfect. You got me. That
Okay.
sounds
Well,
great.
thank you very much for joining. We talked a little bit beforehand about what you wanted to talk about, but given that you're working on GitHub Copilot and that's what attracted a lot of people here, can you give me an overview of what you work on, what you do, what your responsibilities are?
Sweet. Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Sharon. Yeah, I'm a product manager on Copilot. And specifically, I lead the Copilot extensibility team. So you can think about everything around basically our vision is like how do we turn Copilot from not only a product, but an actual platform
Hmm.
that enables you as developers to then build on top of this platform. And really our thinking was we can build all these product features, but no one will be able to scale that better than the developer community and building for all these diverse use cases. So that's really the goal of extensions. And then it started with enabling extensions through chat.
Hmm.
And so from Copilot chat, you can use natural language to talk to your like preferred tools or services, like at Docker, like help me deploy this project or something like that. And the goal is that one, we reduce context switching for you as developers. It's just less back and forth, but also that you can actually start to talk to your tools in natural language is what we think is really cool. So you don't have to remember any obscure commands or queries. And how do we start to bring this all together? So
Yeah.
yeah.
So that sounds great. You had a launch just recently, well, somewhat recently now for extensions. What has the feedback been like? How do you feel? You were super busy around that time. Just tell me everything.
Yeah, I think feedback has been positive. We've kept it pretty limited. Like right now, it's invite only,
Hmm.
only because we were like, let's learn from a small set of users. And also for the folks building, our integrators building extensions, I think this is like a learning process for them. I like to think of it as like really early iOS days. And few folks are even thinking about like, how do we build an app? What makes an app useful? It's the same with these extensions. I think a lot of our partners are like, still very early on in building these integrations and figuring out how to make it useful. So the reception has been good. I'm
Yeah.
very excited to see how it grows, and we're hoping actually in August. And Adam, I'll ping in the list. We're going to open up a like a public wait list, so anyone can sign up on the wait list, and we want to be able to start enabling people in larger quantities to be able to try out these extensions and give us feedback. So yeah.
Okay. So let's say I'm, Joe Schmo, developer somewhere, not a mega company. Could I also make an extension for this once that public waitlist is available?
Yeah, good question. So GitHub's annual conference is called Universe, and that's end of October.
Hmm.
So end of October is when we plan to open it up to all integrators. So as Joe Schmo, you could definitely create an extension starting end of October, but the August waitlist is more for as an end user, you could access the extensions.
I see. I
Yeah,
see. So the ones that a company like Docker made, let's say, and then,
exactly.
okay, that's going to be, yeah, very interesting. So coincidentally, there was a comment just before this started from someone who said Copilot, not necessarily Copilot extensions, really helped this person with accessibility because they're a mouse user and it enabled them to just use the mouse for development. And these extensions sound like that's going to now apply to much more than just coding. So is the general target, even though it's developers, is it more toward the ops side of things, more toward coding, just whatever a company decides they want to make?
Good question. I would say whatever. I think it's starting very software development focused, and it could be anywhere in the software development lifecycle. It could be ops, it could be, security, testing, anything. But my higher level vision is I think it's going to be really cool when these integrations start expanding beyond like these typical software development partners. And so, for example, a Figma extension, a Minecraft extension,
Hmm.
and I think that one of GitHub's missions is like how do we expand to like 1 billion developers, and I see that as more of like how do we broaden what being a developer means? So imagine you have a kid who's on Copilot using the Minecraft extension to like build their own game or build their own Minecraft plugin. That would be awesome, and be able to make all like development and coding just much more accessible for different groups of audiences and people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and with that accessibility comes a flood of development. So this happens with everything, right? An app store launches and people, it's a gold rush to get there first and to, is monetization part of this? Is there a route for the average person to say, I made a Minecraft Copilot extension. I'd like to monetize that for Minecraft users?
Yeah, so that is definitely something in plan. I would say for this universe launch, which I said is end of October, we don't have exact monetization set up, but that is definitely in the direction
Yep.
of we want to see a path where extension builders can, monetize off the platform just like any successful app platform. I think more so when we're launching in broadening to users, it's kind of to really understand, hey, like, is there an appetite for this here? Is
Yeah,
this the right
yeah,
product? And once we get like, I think the right engagement, then I think we're going to move into monetization as well.
I
Yeah,
see. Yeah, I find product fit is definitely the way to go at first and then figure out where you want to go from there. Um, I'm
exactly.
excited. I think this is really cool. And I've been using Copilot myself. And I think I talked to you about this a while ago. And you said back then, I don't know for sure if your title has changed or if this is still part of the umbrella of what you work for, but you said responsible AI was part of what you're doing.
Mhm.
Are you still doing that?
Yeah, so I used to be kind of more of the Copilot responsible AI owner, but actually, thankfully, recently a new PM joined who's now owning that. So I've been focused to move more towards extensions, and she's really owning everything responsible AI. But I would say, even though she's driving a lot of the initiatives, I do think as any product manager, it's important that we all own responsible AI a little bit, not too different from like privacy, accessibility, security. It doesn't really make sense if there's just one person on the team driving that versus everyone on the team taking accountability. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so I wanted to ask a little bit more on this front. Um, Back at the beginning of 2023, Microsoft laid off its ethics and well, I think it was ethics in society is the full name of the
Yeah.
team. And you were one of the people who was affected. Uh, Really fast. Sorry. Thank you for the raid, Alta 4. I'm doing an interview. I don't tend to read chat during this time. I'm interviewing Sharon Lo, who is a product lead at GitHub Copilot. Um, anyway, so you were part of the layoffs back then, and we talked shortly thereafter that layoff. And this is, the very long segue we're going to do into mental health and the tech industry in general. But I wanted to
Yeah.
focus on the ethics and society part of this first. So there is now a new PM. You said she's owning responsible AI at GitHub. But what did it mean when Microsoft shifted to laying off a team and then still having individual folks work on this in their products?
Yeah, I think, man, that's a good question. Very loaded. I think I like try to think. I do think the benefit of the ethics society team when we existed is that we were a horizontal team. So
Hmm.
we basically served ethics in a very bird's eye view fashion. I think that gave the team a lot of oxygen to think deeply about these issues, which I think is really important. Like when you're thinking about questions like, there's been a lot of questions, even for example, for Copilot, right? What is the future of AI development and how do we empower developers and not feel like this is like replacing their jobs or their skills or profession, right? So these are things that I think take a lot of deep thinking and research. And when you're doing it on a product team, it's really hard to have that space
Mm.
because you're just under so much pressure to deliver to customers and bring impact consistently. So the horizontal team I think gave us a lot more time to think deeply about those issues, and that's kind of what I miss. Versus I think now that we've kind of divided a lot of that responsibility per product team, I do think sometimes we get into this hole of a little bit more of like, okay, what is the bare minimum that we need to do versus being able to, again, that extra moment, like extra oxygen gives you time to like think more deeply, think ahead, have foresight and things like that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned loaded question. I'm going to keep going in the loaded direction here a little bit. Microsoft is one of the companies that sets trends for the industry. And by laying
Yeah.
off an ethics and responsibility team, I feel like that sort of sends a message. Do you see this in the broader industry of AI and ethics? Do they are companies being responsible? Do you have insight into that, or is this a more you're focused at Microsoft?
I think it really depends on like what you define responsibility to mean. So I would say that, at the time that our team existed, for us responsibility was not like let's let's just make sure we're like compliant. I think a lot of it was like what is the future of AI and product and how do we make human-centered AI development and designs.
Yeah.
I think that right now, I think responsibility it means something different everywhere, and I think it's what a company has to define. I do think Microsoft's doing a really great job though of being like, okay, what is like policy around RAI? What is developing RAI policy? And how do we really take a approach of like do no harm? So there's a lot of really active investment at Microsoft in terms of what they call responsible AI red teaming.
Hmm.
We quite literally have like SWAT teams that go to these AI products and like majorly test them to understand what are some potential harms and how do we mitigate those harms. I think there's like two axes. One is like mitigate harms, one is like promote the max benefit. And
Mm,
so I feel like ideally, again, you have to figure out where in responsibility do you define as your what you want to be as a company. And I think that will determine then how much you then invest in it.
I
Yeah.
see. I see. And I think there's a natural incentive here to not want your AI to promote bad messages, anything clearly harmful to users. And we've seen some of that in the past happen, and they were kind of snafus, but that was before large language models. Uh,
Yeah.
One of the things I want to ask about here is you've mentioned that this responsibility and ethics team needed to take a larger look at the future of AI and not just, okay, what do we do for right now? And you also mentioned earlier, you don't want developers to feel threatened or like they're going to be replaced. How do you manage that given that every tool that helps us is also a tool that could eventually kind of replace us? What is the thinking internally there to stop that from happening or to ease that transition?
Totally. I think it's more like really thinking about when we think about a developer today, we have talked to a lot of user research in terms of like in your job scope, what are things you want to spend time doing? What
Hmm.
are things you don't want to spend time doing? And what are the things that you wish you had more time to do?
Yeah.
And I feel like the goal of any tool is like, how do we make what you don't want to do super easy or even potentially automated? How do we enable you to do the things you want to do easier for you to have that information and then also give space for you to do the things you want to do? So that's really the principle that I think we think about it. You'll notice that for GitHub Copilot, and I often mention that it was like a very strategic decision to call it like co-pilot. Like it
Yeah.
is your co-pilot, you are the pilot. It's not, like I've seen some products that are like, this is like your AI coworker or your AI engineer. We definitely don't take that stance. Our stance is always like, how do we approach this from a standpoint of where folks would want to give work to like a co-pilot while they drive in the pilot seat. And make those mundane or boilerplate things easier or just like less annoying. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer for this. Someone had asked me a while ago, what are my thoughts on AI? And I said right
Mhm.
now, I think it's just making developers who use it more efficient and that it's not replacing jobs. And someone said, well, what if it does get to that point? And I said, I have more problems than I have time right now. So if it cuts out half of my problems, I'll still have enough problems to solve. If it cuts out 99%, then maybe I'm in trouble. But
Yes.
until we hit that
Yeah.
point, yeah.
Yeah. And
So
I think we talk a lot about like how does AI not only help you get a better answers? So that's kind of our first thing. Like you said, like kind of even in terms of facing your current problems, how do we make that even better?
mhm.
Like how do we give you more context, more information? But also how do we help you ask better questions? And so I think that's really the end goal is like I mentioned, how does this basically enable new types of software engineering that wasn't possible before because you have this extra time, because you have these extra resources, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And you kind of mentioned this with asking better questions. One of the things that I've talked about on the stream in the past is there have been technology introductions that have invalidated a certain category of jobs, but then produced new ones at the same time. So it was like, well, now we have computers, we have automated machinery for all these things, and we need people to operate those and to make new versions of those. And one of the things with AI, the advent of that has been, well, there will be people who are doing prompt engineering who are trying to come up with what's the best. Well, when you mention AI should help us ask better questions, it almost, I mean this half jokingly here, it almost sounds like AI is going to solve its own prompt engineering problems by making you ask better questions that you'll feed into the AI to give you your answers to those questions.
Yeah, yeah, totally. But it is very ironic as you're saying that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and one of the things we talked about a while ago was Devin. Devin had just came out, I think, when we first kind of scheduled the interview, and unfortunately, it's not a totally free product, and there are some open source variants that I looked into at the time, but those were positioned as like a, hey, this is a software engineer that you could essentially use to replace a more junior person on your team.
Yeah.
I feel like there's been less focus on that now as companies are pushing wider AI products. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how do you see AI positioned when it comes to specifically junior engineers? How do you see them using it? What is the impact on junior developers?
Yeah, I feel like I think it's also again teasing apart like what is in the act of development. I think there's the act of coding, but I think the actual act of like software engineering and creating is is separate. I mean, they're all combined,
Yeah.
right? I always think of, I think Copilot can help you with coding and it can help you with software, but I think it's going to not necessarily be in the place of helping you really understand what do I want to create? How do I be innovative around that? How do I actually design the architecture of a system? Like these are things that maybe the AI can improve in. And so I would say for junior developers, I feel like there's a lot of ways that like I've sometimes I think about how different my me getting computer science degree would have been with Copilot. Like I struggled so much on Stack Overflow as I feel like a lot of us did through that time. And I like to think of it as I think every junior developer being really intentional again about what do they want to be good at and how do they hone those skills. And again, what are those more boilerplate coding things that would make sense for you to divvy up to like a co-pilot or get instructional learning? Um, but again, I don't have all the answers. I do kind of really wonder what is the effect of AI on the profession of developers and just I feel like we grew up on such a way where we had to tinker to like the very, very bottom of a stack. And I think that helps in a lot of ways of when things go wrong, we need to troubleshoot. We really understand everything that is involved. I think when coding starts moving, as you start moving coding to maybe more of a natural language approach of like you want to code in natural language, if something goes wrong, like who has the expertise to be able to troubleshoot it? These are open questions I have. So I don't know, Adam. Actually, if you've thought about, it, I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah. So, when people ask me, there have been some very sort of strong opinions shared in my community about I don't think AI is good for junior developers. And
Mm,
I look at this sort of like how you do. It's a tool. And I think of a tool as being something you can provide harm or benefit with. When it comes to junior developers, I think I've actually met some people in real life who've said, "Oh yeah, I worked on this some project." And I was like, "Oh, how did you do that? That sounds pretty complex." And they said, "I use ChatGPT." I thought, "Oh
mm,
boy, like what does this mean for this person's learning? What is the quality of the output that they produce for their company?" And I think that's a case of them leaning too much on the tool so that they then don't know how to build that thing themselves. And I
yeah,
remember maybe 20 years ago or something at this point, I remember asking people, what if computers got so complex that any individual person couldn't understand it? And they said, well, then we'd have specialists and we'd have people to fill in the gaps and we'd still have that knowledge somewhere and AI will always exist to help us. So I think my general take is AI is similar to Stack Overflow that you mentioned in that you can go to another resource and ask them for help, just like how you could walk over to a coworker, tap them on the shoulder, and get the answer to any of your questions you're going to have as a new hire. But that doesn't mean you
yeah.
should do it. So, yeah, I think it's about responsibly using the tool and then augmenting your learning with it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I do think that it's hard because I feel like especially as a junior developer, that's when you're really learning all the foundations. And I feel like being able to really learn the foundations and then using AI as a tool to help you expedite once you understand the foundation solidly. I think the question is like, yeah, what's the right balance of using AI to help you learn the foundations?
yeah,
And I think it probably means something different for everyone. So
it probably
yeah.
does. And given that I haven't been a junior developer for a while, I feel like everything I'm using AI for now is the stuff I didn't want to do. It's like you said, the things that were annoying that I wanted to do less of. So in
Yeah.
my mind, it's like a really smart autocomplete at this point. And I actually equate it a little bit to that for some people. It's like who texts nowadays or sends any message without using the suggestions that pop up above your phone's keyboard. Probably everyone's using those and can expect that when you type what, it's going to say, "Are you doing today?" or something like that. And and then there are times when you know not to use it. So yeah, I think it's applying when it matters and skipping it when it doesn't. This
Yeah.
leads me to my next kind of broad question here. And you touched on this a little bit, but where do you see AI technology development 10 years from now? Not just, next year, let's say Copilot extensions has been great, people are using it, but that's natural
Mhm.
language and everything. What are we doing? Yeah, 5 years, 10 years from now, what's the long-term vision?
I I honestly kind of wish I had a better answer to this. I feel like because it's funny in the sense that I think that AI has made my morphing like has warped my sense of time,
Hmm.
in that I think the progression of AI has honestly been just pretty insane. Like I just think about, was it like 2019 when GPT, was it 1 came out? And I think look at where we are now, and just even the last couple of years from GPT 3 to where we are with GPT 4.0. And so I feel like even my sense of like time, if I'm like, oh, I think this will happen in 10 years, I'm like, is this going to happen in like 2 years?
Yeah.
And then like, and then I don't even know what's possible in 10 years. So um, I do think these questions of like, AI, your skill set and us having to adapt will just like change so much. Um, and so I'm gonna have to marinate on that one a little bit. I just think that like the rate of change is very insane, and I think us having to think a little very intentionally about what is the work we do, when do we use AI, how do we not abuse it, how do we not over rely on it, what is that right mix of skill set, I think is gonna become a lot more blurry, because I think that a lot of those skill sets will overlap more and more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny you mentioned the rapid growth. I remember probably late 90s, I got some like, it looked like a long pencil. It was a microphone. And I don't know what software it was, Microsoft Word, maybe some add-on thing that said, "Hey, we can transcribe your voice. It'll be like you'll never have to use a keyboard again." And this is when computers are still relatively new to households, and it was terrible. It didn't work. It was a garbage product. And yet now I could literally take probably any phone from any friend I see and say something like, "Remind me to do something," and it'll correct any mistakes, hesitation, stuttering, etc. That's something that we just never would have expected. And okay, cool, that's for a personal assistant. But yeah, what happens when you are saying to Docker, just write the Docker file for me. Just go deploy this on
Yeah.
Docker Hub, go pull in these images, and it does it. And yeah, then what are we focusing on and what are we doing? So I get when you say that this might be the hyper growth that we're seeing, such that it's hard to predict 5 years from now. And
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder what we'll be doing and how we'll be doing it. And who knows how it'll change. So
I think yeah, I think that's why I feel like it's almost to a point where I feel like we have to be able to, I think, envision even a couple years out though, and really try to be really intentional of like, instead of letting the technology, like instead of letting AI develop and then ask ourselves, well, what does it mean to be like an engineer or developer or like an artist or a writer or all these other professions? I think it's better for us to be able to be really intentional to find that right now and use AI to like, I feel like it's just like AI is moving so fast, it's easy to be reactive to these things versus trying to define our principles and we're like, what is the world that we want to create, and then moving towards that. Yeah.
well, and the I don't know if you've heard of the tragedy of the commons, but I feel like every individual person is trying to almost right now figure out how is AI working for them. And whether it means as a developer, am I using something like Copilot, or it means if you're on the outside of this, am I using it for content writing, ideation, anything like that? At some point, you have enough individual agents in the system where there is no collective, there is no horizontal team, like you mentioned earlier, saying, hey, we're not being responsible with this. But by the time that's happened, the damage could be done. Do you
Yeah.
see something like that happening here where things are moving so fast that there is no way to organize it, to tame it?
I think that's my biggest fear is I definitely feel like with AI and technology, it's kind of like putting toothpaste back in the tube. Like once it's all out, it's going to be really hard to be able to. And I think that's why policy is like trying to catch up. But I actually think, again, besides people in policy regulators, I actually think the strongest voice are people like you as customers and consumers of these products, right? If you being able to define, because I think as even as I think about the product manager on my side, right? As Copilot, I talk to users like you, Adam, and like customers and be like, what are the features you want?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it circumvents on you actually being really specific of like, well, what do I want my role to be in like, what would be my dream ideal developer life? And how do the tools around me then, support that? And then as a PM, I build towards that future,
Yeah.
versus you relying on me as a PM to be like, okay, just build these products because we're just going to optimized for profit. I think that's just, and I try, that's why I try to remember, like, as a user and as customers, you actually have so much more power than sometimes it feels like we're very beholden to these like large tech companies and how AI is being developed. But at the end of the day, you are the consumers and you guys are the people making the decisions of like which product wins out, right? So
Yeah, I see a tug of war there because I think there is a mix of those things. There's a mix of customer research impacting the product and then the product team impacting people's workflows. So it was like
yeah,
Apple, I'm assuming, probably didn't necessarily ask a ton of people, hey, do you want a phone with no buttons? And if they had,
yeah,
it's like the Henry Ford expression. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses instead of a
that's
car.
true. Yeah.
So I don't know for sure that I don't know who has more power in that equation. But with that said, I want to ask you a question going back a little bit, which is you said you do user research, you ask people. I don't want you to violate an NDA or anything, but what's the sort of general sentiment you get when you talk to average developers? What are they looking for? What are the things that they say they want?
I would say right now, I think the biggest question, and I feel like it's more of an understanding of why someone would use GitHub Copilot versus something like ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest things we ask are some flavors of customization and context, which
Yeah.
is like, I don't want to talk to like a generalized AI assistant. I want to talk to an AI assistant who knows my code base in GitHub, who knows my understanding of what makes good code versus bad code, my best practices, my knowledge. And if you think about this expanding to like a team or a business, everyone has their own customized context. And so I think a lot of it is like, how do we improve what seems like quality, but really is just content that's more personalized to your context and your domain.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's really the biggest flavors of asks that we get. Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
on a sort of broader note, maybe a level separate from this, are they saying things like, I want to be faster at my job. I want to not have to write unit tests or something. Are they ever talking about some specific areas?
I think we do measure a lot of those metrics of like, and it's also not just like, are you more efficient? It's like, are you more fulfilled? And I
Mm,
can send you like, do you feel happier with how you spend your day? As an engineer, do you feel like you're spending less time on like tasks that you don't want to do, kind of what I talk like operational things or things like that? And so we do measure a lot of those like fulfillment or satisfaction metrics to really understand at the end of the day, are developers here. I think that sounds very generalized. But for us, it's
mm.
like not just about efficiency. It's like at the end of the day, I always feel like efficiency is a little bit of a product con because it's like, am I just being more efficient so I can do more work? And I think that's not really the goal, really, is like, are you being more efficient? So again, you can things with your time that you actually find more fulfilling.
Yeah, I love that question. Are you more fulfilled as a developer? And it's those kind of qualitative metrics that are really hard to analyze because it means different things for different people. But at
Yeah.
the end, as you were asking those questions, I was like, I am pretty happy to be using Copilot. It does save me time. And every once in a while, I type a comment for what I'm about to do. I press enter, and it was like, oh, there's the function I would have written had I even thought
Yeah.
about it for longer than just writing a comment. So, um, I want to transition a little bit here because the last part you mentioned
The
is
one question, Adam, that I would love to hear, do you feel more fulfilled as a developer using Copilot? And I guess what does fulfillment mean for you?
fulfillment as a developer. That's kind of tough. I think here's what it means to me. I want to do work that is interesting to me, and I'd like to feel like I'm progressing as I'm doing that work. So not have something take 3 months. And I think it's those two things that sum up fulfillment. So for example, I do a lot of what I would call grunt work, which
Mm.
if I were in a big company, there would be a mix of different level people working there. And this is probably something more junior developers would be doing. But because typically I'm working on a 1 or 2 person team, it's not easy to divide the work in that way. So if AI could take some of that off of my shoulders, I think that would be great. It's not necessarily doing that yet, but I'd love for that to happen. And then what else plays into fulfillment? Trying to think. I guess it'd be easier if I had a released product right now and I were iterating on it and had AI to help me with that. But unfortunately, it was like I was working in the corporate world for the last 3 years and only just started using AI outside of that now. So hard for me to comment more than that.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's cool. It's just cool to hear to me. Like you said, fulfillment means something very different for everyone. So it's always interesting to hear. So yeah.
yeah. And I'll have to think about that some more too as I continue to use AI. One of the things that I did, I got the monthly Copilot subscription because I thought, oh, I want to try other companies' products. But a combination of sort of it's working well enough and I'm a little bit lazy about it and I'm not sure which other products I would use have just led me sticking to it and paying more per month than I should be. So, um, anyway, that thing that you mentioned, it's almost a product con for something to be too efficient here. Am I doing more work? This is a great segue into one of the other topics we wanted to talk about, which was tech, mental health, burnout. And there has been a general trend across pretty much every industry of efficiency has risen over the last 200 years, and yet our hours haven't really terribly changed too much. And I don't know
Yeah.
if they've tracked this for mental health as well. Technology is relatively new as a field that people could go into and get a degree in. But you've said that you used to be very career oriented and that that's starting to change. So I want to just kind of leave it at that, not even really ask a very specific question, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say there's like a long story or short story version of this. I'm trying to figure out how I would start this, but I would say just growing up in the environment. So I grew up in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, like peak Silicon Valley, immigrant parents, and I think a lot of that culture is very centered around like achievement. And so I think for a very long time, my sense of self identity was really wrapped around achievement. And I think it started with like things you do in school to, what school you went to. And then when you went to a school, then what became my job, right? And basically, I think that, when I joined the Ethics Society team, that was actually probably a really good wake up call for me because at the time, that was kind of like my dream job. It was this, I think my ultimate pinnacle was always to get to this point where I could find a job that was like it paid, but also like I felt super fulfilled and I felt passionate. I loved my coworkers. Um, and it was amazing for a few years. But basically, I think that my identity became very, very singular. Like I remember thinking through like people would ask me like like who are you, like what do you do, and the first thing I would say is like, oh, I work on this ethics team at Microsoft. And, like it was just one of those like it was such a salient part of my identity. And I think when the layoff happened, it was like a really big reckoning for me of like what does it mean for your identity to one be so singular. I think that there's a really good book called The Good Enough Job where it talks about how sometimes the happiest and most resilient people just have really multiple sets of identities,
Mm.
and like you're not just a person that works at GitHub. You are a wife, you are a daughter, you are a friend, you are a snowboarder, you are a cook. Like the more pillars you have of identity, when one falls, you have a lot to fall back on. And I really realized at that point that I really didn't have much other ones to fall back on.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's kind of been my focus now, which is when I'm less career oriented, it's more like I'm by saying no to just investing all my time and energy in my job. I think I'm saying yes to making time for other things in my life. And so, yeah.
I see. Okay. So I want to jump back to something in the middle there. You said Bay Area when you were growing up, but then you mentioned that people ask, who are you? What do you do? And it jumps to, okay, here's what I do for a living. Uh, we both live in the Seattle area for viewers,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's part of the culture here. I think it is so common. We're in this tech bubble that if you meet someone new, it's where do you work? And the answer is usually one of about five things, and then that's it. And then you ask, okay, are you a dev? Are you a PM there? And the conversation sort of progresses in almost a predictable way. And yet in
Yes.
other parts of the world, it doesn't necessarily play out that way. You have more
Yeah.
of the other identities that you mentioned that come in, and someone might say, oh, I'm a snowboarder, instead of here's
Mhm.
where I work. So you said, I want to invest time in other aspects. Do you feel like that's helped you carve out the other Sharon identities that now exist?
I do. And actually, it's kind of been a year in the making, but even my partner, he commented on the other day. He's like, it's kind of crazy how because like something will bother me at like something I'll say like, oh, this thing happened at work. I'm like, that's fine. And I'll just kind of go about my day. And he's like, you've changed a lot because I think something like that would have really affected me in the past. So it was like I think it was not like a conscious like I'm gonna like by next month I'm going to like change, but I think by slowly diverting my time by something coming up at 7 p.m. and I'm like, you know what? It can wait till tomorrow. Nothing's gonna be on fire if I don't address it right now. I'm gonna go out and hang out with my friends. It's gonna be fine. Like by doing repetitive acts of that, I've actually found myself just less and less identifying with my job. It's still something that I want to do a great job in. But if someone asks me like, who is Sharon? What do you do? Or like, what do you like to do? I would actually say my job realistically is probably like fifth, or like it's a lot lower on when I would introduce myself than it used to be. So and I think it means something different for everyone. I think that's why I love the title, the good enough job,
Hmm.
because for some people, they might want their job to be much more prominent of their identity, and that's totally fine. I think it should be a really conscious decision. And I think for me, it was just like subconscious because of how I grew up, and then realizing that that just wasn't serving me personally.
Yeah, there's what I kind of call mental or cultural programming that is so hard to escape. It's like if you come from a family where they pat you on the back when you get good grades or when you do something impressive, then you're much more likely to pursue those things because that's kind of all you really care about as a kid, right? Is the sort of validation and approval of some of the people around you. And then you get into that cycle. And I find that, as you mentioned here, it's not like you sat down and said, okay, in the next month, I'm going to do this. It's these small ways of steering yourself toward an outcome that, yeah, eventually happens and you start seeing in these healthy ways. And I think it could come with as small as a language change and as large as a plan that you devote yourself to over the course of a year or something like that. So I think that's really cool. I want to now get a little bit more specific with this. So you have said that working for these companies, that it's almost like capitalism is counter to mental health at these companies.
Yeah.
I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit there, but can you expand on that?
I just think that similar with like, again, I think intentionality everywhere in your life is just really important. And I think at work, right? A in a corporate world, the more you can produce as output, the better.
Hmm.
And the more you let it, the more it will allow you to.
Yeah.
So like I think that was like one of I think the advice I got from a really early mentor was just he was just like, just FYI, like your to-do list at work will never end.
Yep.
Like the more you finish it, the more people will give you. They're like, great, that's like let me just let's have you do more, right? And so you have to really set that boundary. And I think that's why when I say capitalism is just like antithesis in the sense of like it will just keep having a hunger appetite in terms of wanting to maximize output, wanting to produce more output. And so there's no really sense of, I think, sustainability in
Yeah.
capitalism. Like in the end, if like you're not growing, if you're not growing in terms of profit, it's seen as like a bad thing, right? And I think that there's so many seasons of us as humans, right, where maybe we're like not growing on the outside, but we're actually doing a lot of inner work on the inside. And so I think that's why I feel like I've been more intentional about like I've kind of in some ways like surrendering has been kind of I think a release of like I know I'll never be able to produce the maximum output forever because I'm just not a machine. And so what do I want to give like today? And like what are my priorities today? And so that's kind of really how I try to look at my life now. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that intentionality is what I've read. I ended up reading a lot of different self-help books. And I think the most important thing to take from any of those is you are making decisions at every point of every day by whatever action you choose to do, because there's a practically infinite number of other actions you could have done and didn't do. And
Yeah.
on the whole, it doesn't matter, which sandwich you choose for lunch. But when it comes to something like, I want to put in an extra 3 hours of work per day, or yeah, how do you spend your time that way? I think it really matters. Um,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have
And I
been,
would say
oh,
something I'll add at it, like I haven't never done this, but it was actually really good actually because I'm personally also like I think part of the whole immigrant thing, I'm a people pleaser. So it's also really hard. That is something I've battled. Someone's like, "Hey Sharon, can you do this at work?" It's hard for me to say no. But I haven't done this personally. But like for anyone that struggles with this, I had a friend who actually had like a no journal.
mhm,
And she would literally write down in this journal every time she said no to something. Like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. But then under the no, she would say, by saying no to this, what can I now say yes to?
I see.
And
Yeah.
I think it helps you reprogram your brain a little bit. Um, because I do think when I was laid off, I had a couple months where I wasn't working.
Mhm.
And it was truly kind of mind blowing for me because I used to have like the Sunday scaries a little bit. And I'm like, oh, it's like Monday's going to be work. And I remember I woke up that first Monday after getting laid off and I was like, oh my gosh, Monday is just like another Saturday. Like, and then I wake up again, I'm like, Tuesday is also another Saturday. And I'm like, well, how do I want to spend my day today? And it really showed me like how much time is in a week and how much I was using my week as in like I would basically the entire week I'd be like either at work or just kind of decompressing from work. And then I would have like some slivers of the weekend where I'm kind of recharging versus it really showed me like how much I'm putting into work every day and being really intentional about that and saying like, okay, if I'm going to say no to, this 5 o'clock meeting, what am I saying yes to? And what does that offer me? So yeah.
Yeah, I it's like there's this, monster under your bed all the time that you just can't avoid. It's there, you're thinking about it, it stops you from going to sleep, it produces anxiety. And yet these realizations are something that probably need to be applied to practically everybody around us, right? Like we're not alone in the tech industry, and a lot of these top level jobs have these anxiety cycles. I've heard Sunday scaries from a lot of different people, and and I think part of this has to do with the country culture that we have in the US, which is generally not a ton of vacation time, not a lot of focus outside of work. And it's not as bad as other countries that maybe are working, 12 hours a day, but it's not helpful for us. What is some simple advice someone could apply if they feel like what you're saying resonates with them? And they're like, oh, yeah, I am focused on work. This is the first thing that comes to mind when I share who I am to somebody new. And I do want to achieve results more and more. What's the first step they can take to end that?
I would say so. One thing that I think I forgot, it's a quote somewhere was like, pay attention to what you pay attention to.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think just notice like what are things outside of your work or what are things actually, I think going back to your childhood is a great example because I think that's when you're kind of the most pure in terms of your interests. And think a little bit about like what would you like to do?
Yeah.
And I think another maybe even taking my layoff example is like imagine you didn't have to go to work for like for months. What would you do with your time? What would you like to do? And like we talked about, start doing those like little actions of like, okay, today I'm going to, and I think there's that whole thing of like, does willpower come before the action or after? And I was like, just set up the action. And as you start doing those things, you're going to enjoy them and naturally you will start to, I think, maybe prioritize those over work. And like I was saying, I also don't want to emphasize that sometimes I also think there's like this cultural norm of like if you spend too much time at work, you're like broken. I don't necessarily think that's true. Like if you actually find a lot of fulfillment at work, then that's great. I think that for me personally, I just realized I was putting a lot of my energy and effort into something that's ultimately run by a corporation and where those incentives are sometimes misaligned.
Yeah.
But if, for example, you're trying to build a project, you're trying to build a startup that you're super passionate about, I think it's totally valid if you're like, no, I actually do want to dedicate all of my time to work. It's what I find most fulfilling. That's totally fine too. It's just like you have to define that for yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with that. And I wanted to ask you, if it wasn't for tech, what do you think you would be doing?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I daydream a lot. I think it would be so many. I think I always loved like creating things. I used to write a lot as a kid. So I think it'd be a mix of like writing, teaching. I thought about like opening up a coffee shop. That would be like a big dream of mine, but it'd be more like a salon thing where like creatives can like gather and I'd be like the old grandma that's like feeding everyone so that people can come together. So there's like all these dreams I have. And my eventual goal is like I do think I don't know. I do really hope that there is like a healthier version of what tech looks
Hmm.
like sometimes I think about this like relentless pursuit of like growth, and I'm not sure why why we need it. It's like, do we need profit to maximize every single quarter? Like if it's slower one quarter, but it has the time for the team to like think more creatively, like is that actually more beneficial? And um yeah,
Yeah.
I would love to be able to like influence that culture some way. I just don't really know how yet. Yeah.
It's tough because it's a very enmeshed culture, and there are a lot of different incentives, and a lot of these companies that we're sort of implicitly talking about are publicly traded and are now at the behest of shareholders and the general public. So, um, I want to back up to, let me think about this, the coffee shop, the salon.
many things.
Oh, yeah, I remember what it was. So, one of the things that came about when people were talking about AI maybe a year or two ago was, okay, what happens when it has, they were being very doom and gloom about this. What happens when it has consumed all of our jobs and we don't have anything to do? And people started talking about, okay, there could be a universal basic income where we're basically paying people to have the ability to get by, to pay rent, to
Mhm.
get groceries, to live. Um, in that case, where we're kind of merging the topics here of AI and your dream to start up a salon/coffee shop, do you think you would do that? Do you think you would pursue it, or do you think it'd be hard to get away from that sort of itch to be still productive, even though you're starting to detach from it?
I feel like that's a good question. I do think there's like this sense of like, I think when I talked a lot about creation, I do think I find a lot of fulfillment in like creating and like doing something that involves creating something that didn't exist
Yeah,
before, whether that be a piece of writing, a piece of art, or whatever. And when I think about the salon idea, it was the idea of like, how do you basically bring about an idea that maybe wouldn't have existed if these people didn't gather in the same room? So I think that that itch would never truly go away. And I think that's when people say, like, what would you do when you retired? I retired. I don't think I would just like there's some people who are like, I would just like chill every day. Like I would travel and just like chill. And I think for me, I would think I would get bored. Like I think I
yeah.
would need to like go back to creating something, interacting with people. And so that's kind of my taste is like I think I would still go back to doing something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of you're at the intersection of you work career oriented, you're doing well at your job, and then also being creative. And I feel like there's this not antsiness, I think that's the wrong way to describe it, but an itch to do more, to produce. And I feel that same itch myself. Like there's a lot of creative stuff I want to do, and if these projects all get done, I'll just replace them with a bunch of other projects.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do I have when you kept saying we have this relentless need for growth, it reminded me there was a video just called, I think, Line Goes Up, which was talking about cryptocurrencies and NFTs and how we have this need to just to see numbers go up and to get progress and have companies grow. And I wonder, do I have that embedded in me somehow? And that's what's driving me. And that some amount of that is healthy and too much of that is unhealthy. So,
Totally.
yeah.
I feel that because I think I talked to my partner. He doesn't feel the same like itch of like creation, I would say. Like he is much more of like a relaxing, chill kind of person. Um, but but yeah, I think that maybe it's also just like wanting to create at the helm of like what I want to create. I
Hmm.
think also when you're creating at a corporate setting, it's you take a lot of soul out of creation sometimes, right? And so many ideas are things that you just kind of mull around for a long time. And it doesn't necessarily look like you're creating, but you could be going on a walk and you're just thinking about this idea over and over and over again, right? And so I think that's the freedom I want to have is like if I actually had a lot more mental space to think about these different ideas, like what would actually be created as a result of that. Yeah.
Yeah. If only we could see the parallel timelines that, jut out from any decision we've made. The Sharon who went to GitHub and the Sharon who just started up the coffee shop immediately, which one is
Right.
happier and what were the sacrifices that had to be made? Maybe that's
Yeah.
something AI can do for us once it's gotten the context close enough. We just feed in our lives and we say, pick the future that's better for me.
I feel like it would break us in some ways in the sense of like we would just be like completely in analysis paralysis of like how everything, but yeah, I totally agree.
Well,
So
I asked a few people this hypothetical a long time ago. Imagine there was a device where you could press a button and it just printed out a little sheet of paper with the food you would enjoy the most at that particular moment, just through magic.
mm,
Who knows how this works exactly? And I said to people, would you use it? And some people said, no, like I need the free will of having chosen my meal and that's what makes it good to me. And I thought for me, it's like, well, if somehow some magic knows what I want, why would I not at least consider that into my own thought process? So I think that's almost what's happening with AI to some extent is we have a thought process, we have some general questions, and we ask something to guide us through that or to help us. Um, anyway, I'm not actually going anywhere with that. I just
no, no, I love this thought experiment. As you're talking, like I'm like, would I use it? I think I would be the same thing. I think I'd want to know. I might not want it to dictate exactly what I do, but I think I would want it as like a point of like data of like what I would consider for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think that's what you touched on there is it's almost like what you have to do. If again, Magic knows that this is what you want best, and you every time you press this button, you're like, now I have to go get this thing, and sure, it'll make me the happiest. But what is my life now? I'm
Yeah.
essentially an extension of a machine that I
Yeah.
take in this input and provide an output. Um,
Totally.
yeah, I want to jump back a bit to a quote that you said a while ago. Actually, two quotes. One is you said you don't think that the tech industry is sustainable in its current form. Um, what did you mean by that? Do you want to give some background? Do you still feel this way?
In the sense of, I think a lot of people I talk to in the tech industry, and I would love to hear your thoughts, Adam, actually, because I feel like you've done a good, I'd love to, because I feel like you've bounced from corporate to non-corporate to back to corporate, etc. But I feel like I hear a lot of friends who just are super burnt out. Um, and not really knowing how to sustain growth at a tech company, as I've mentioned, because it's not, I think it's meant for a different kind of, it's not meant for any kind of sustaining. So I think that's one thing. Um, so I think there's that. I think I've also talked to a lot of mentors in like higher points of leadership. And I think they've helped me really see I think the sacrifices they've had to make in the sense of they always tell me like, hey, like when you I think sometimes when you're working, it's your goal is to like get promoted and kind of
Mm-hmm.
grow up the ladder. But they're like every time you go up a ladder, you're making a sacrifice. So be really conscious of what that means of or do you really want to get promoted to that next level? It probably is going to mean a different set of responsibilities. It's going to mean a different set of time investment, a different set of work-life balance, and what are you willing to commit to? Um,
Yeah, and
and so yeah.
I was gonna say those jump starts pretty small. When you go from a junior level 1 to a junior level 2, it really is just a promotion. It's pretty minimal. It's but then yeah, at some point you get to a now I'm leading a 50-person team instead of a 10-person team, which is a drastically different amount of input required from you. So
Super different.
yeah,
Yeah.
to answer your question of what are my thoughts on this, this is overkill, and this sounds like a giant company made me do this, but I just came up with this on my own, which is every Monday I look through a set of tenets that I wrote for myself, and they're generally
Mm,
like 3 to 5 things, principles I want to uphold, or some quality I want to maintain. And the one that I think is the key tenet for the entire endeavor I'm doing right now is sustainability in terms of could I do this for, let's say, 10 or 20 years? You mentioned that after you'd been laid off, that Monday felt like another Saturday and Wednesday felt like another Saturday. And I feel like if you think about what goals you have and you plan a timeline for them, let's say it's, start up this coffee shop. Let's say I gave you the funds and the time to do this. It probably wouldn't take you longer than about 3 to 5 years for it to be, at its peak successfulness for one location. Maybe then you expand it to more. I don't know, but it's not going to take you 50 years to do that. And yet
right.
you reasonably have at least 50 more years to live. So what do you do with the next 45 years after that, or the next, 20? And that's what is kind of trying to guide my next however long portion of time, which is can I be sustainable? Can I do this? And I think the mix for me is sort of like what you mentioned earlier about the satisfaction you get from your job, liking your coworkers. In my case, that's why I'm on stream. I like
Mm,
having an audience. I like talking to people. I like interacting throughout the day, and yet having the creative freedom to do what I want to do in terms of, okay, I want to make a game now. I'll go set out 6 months and I'll make this game. So
yeah.
if that requires, like I said, the time and the money to do that. And I've worked now for long enough where I feel like I've carved out some space for myself. So I don't think this is scalable to just anybody. But I think that if people could find jobs that fit those qualities that they have, and it's a non-trivial thing to do. The jobs are out there, but how do you find them? How do you vet them? That there probably would be a higher net happiness in the world. And it's just, yeah, how do you solve that problem? How do you do job matchmaking correctly there?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. And I do think tech is kind of in this like ultra unsustainable point because of like the job market is really tough right now,
Yeah.
right? I'm not going to deny. And so I do think everyone's kind of in this state of fear and anxiety. So there's kind of this like even more overwork happening where it's like, well, I don't, want to get laid off. I want to make sure that I'm not replaceable. And there's a lot of people like who are on visas and like this, like losing their job could have a lot of consequences. So I've seen cycles just recently in the last few years. I think tech now is I think is very different from where it was like I think like 10 years ago when I started my career. And I'm sure we'll go through another wave recently. I just feel like right now it just feels like in this ultra unsustainable point.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that is post-pandemic. There was hyper growth, and now we're finally in this cooling off period. And for a lot of people who started their career in the last, let's say, 5, 6 years, they just it was just this line goes up thing, and they just thought, oh, I can predict that it's going to just keep rising. So now there's this, yeah. I want to ask you before I'm going to cover the second quote. Do you remember what this second quote is that you said to me a while ago that I want to bring up now, just based on
I
this?
do
You
not.
what? You
I
don't?
do, yeah.
Okay, so you had said, and I'm going to read this here. PM1, so product manager one or program manager one back then, is the best level to be at. So, um, I wanted to ask you. Let's say you were offered a position. GitHub,
Yeah.
Microsoft. They come to you and they say, "You can be it. You can be a PM1. You can be a PM1 the rest of your career." Do you think now that you've been at the level you're at, that you would enjoy it? Do you think you would take that opportunity?
Ooh, good question. I would seriously consider it. I think I was actually talking to my partner where while I think it for me would be this like trade-off between like how much more like mental bandwidth I would get if I were to increase my level, how much more time I would get. Because I do think that growing as an experienced PM, I think I would be able to do a PM1 job in like less time
Yeah,
and like effort. Um, while like what is the pay difference and like what does that look like to me? And how does that financially matter? Um, so it's not off the table, I would say. I would really consider it because I think as I've grown in my career, as I mentioned, I was super career focused. So I did grow very quickly without really realizing that. And now that I'm where I'm at, I look at my boss's job and I think really critically of like, because people always say like, as you grow, like just look at your boss. That's probably going to be the direction that you're going to head
yeah, yeah,
towards. And I think really critically, like, would I want her job? And I see a lot of sacrifices that she makes. She's online late at night. She has to deal with a whole set of politics, and things that I don't have to. And so I always think like, yeah, and yeah, I'm sure she's getting paid much more, but I'm like, is that the trade-off I want? And so I think I would make the same one also going down. So not off the table. I would say very, very much something of consideration.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. You mentioned mental bandwidth, time, and pay. What you didn't mention is fulfillment. Do you feel like you would be able to do the work for, let's say, 2 years now that you'd be down leveling yourself by quite a lot? Would that get to you at all?
That's a good question. But I feel like it's interesting because it's so much more of like how much I don't necessarily define my self-fulfillment from my
Okay.
job
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, but I would say I do think that like in the sense that I'm still doing the same role. If you were like, would you want to become an engineer? I think that would be really different
Yeah.
because I think I find the task of an engineer a little bit different from where I feel fulfillment versus I think as a PM, there's a lot of like communication, bringing people together. So I think I would be still doing those things, which is why I didn't think about it as much. But I could see how like the lack of agency would get to me, I would say. I do think as a more senior PM, you have a lot more say of like this is how I think it should be versus the more junior one, you're kind of more taking direction and just executing. So going from that to like a straight executor, yeah, maybe I would get like a little bit bored.
Yeah, well,
So
and I don't mean to say like that will definitely happen, but I think it would be tough for me for sure. As you were
yeah.
talking, I remembered a movie it had Robert De Niro in it, and he had like a ton of company experience in this movie. I don't remember what it was called. And he
Yeah.
had to go back and work as like an entry level employee. And it was very much like an old fashioned, like, I'm going to work super hard and make it back to the top. I wondered as you were answering that, oh, I'm a PM1, I wouldn't have as much agency. If people would also look at you like a PM1, if that makes sense, and treat it as like, well, she doesn't have the experience. That's why she's that level right now. And that might start getting on your nerves. But anyway, this is a wild hypothetical that we don't need to.
It's actually really interesting because I have a friend at Facebook, and I don't know if that's still the case, but when we were at Microsoft, it's your level is very much marketed. Like it's like PM1,
Yep.
PM2,
Yep. Yep.
PM3, senior, right? But I think at Facebook, unless you're like a director, everyone is just PM. So they hide
Mm,
the level. just so that when you're going, because people would actually change their posture for you to you in conversations of like, oh, you're a principal, let me talk to you in that way, but you're a PM1, let me talk to you that way. And they basically remove that whole level. And so that would be very interesting to me of like, what if everyone is basically a PM unless you're like your director level and like that your title has less of how you're being treated.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I never watched Undercover Boss, but I imagine there were some times where the CEO of the company or whatever is probably treated terribly because they just assume, oh, you're just some other random person here.
Exactly. But I don't know. I think a big part of that also, I think another dimension I didn't talk about, Adam, going back to the when you say no, what do you say yes to?
Hmm.
I kind of always joke because, like, sometimes in my personal life, it's like such a mess. Like, I think people think that because I'm so organized at work, because as a PM, you're like creating plans and like specs, that you're pretty organized in your personal life. My personal life is not. Like, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, like I have this bill and I need to. And like, I'm like, oh my God. And so it's kind of chaotic. And I always joke it's because like I put all of my PM energy in like the 40 hours. I don't have like the energy to PM the rest of my life. Like I just want to chill. So sometimes I think like, oh, maybe if I said no to like putting that much PM energy at work, maybe I would actually have more bandwidth to do this, like maybe in a volunteer opportunity or a nonprofit or my personal life. And so maybe also evaluating what I would say yes to as a result.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and we have a limited pool of energy. So I feel like maybe, I've heard of all sorts of different fatigue. There's compassion fatigue where you can't just keep feeling sad or sorry for other people or even relate to them if it just happens so much. And then there's just literal fatigue, which is you're out of energy. So yeah, after you
Yeah.
work, it's hard. I couldn't help but laugh as you were telling me that because you kind of touched on it at the beginning. You said, "Have I cleaned up my room enough?" But
Yeah,
I did.
literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was funny because I feel like it was even with Adam, we were with a group of friends, and I think they were super surprised to find that like how I am in my personal life is just not who I am at work. I think that people think who I am at work is very different, and it was just funny because yeah, I think
Yeah, well,
yeah.
it's a different take on the multiple personalities or multiple identities, but excuse me, not personalities. Yeah, so you
Mhm.
identify as an organized person at work and an unorganized person, I guess, at home. Um,
Yeah.
well, look, it's been about an hour. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your thoughts on all this. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we leave?
No, I just want to say thanks, Adam. It was love talking. This was super fun. I really enjoyed it.
Good, I'm glad. Yeah,
Yeah,
I did too.
I didn't see the comments, but I don't know if anyone has any follow-up comments. I think Adam, you have my email, but if you don't, I'm happy and I'm happy to answer any questions like offline as
Yeah,
well.
sure.
So
And let me check really fast here because I put a couple of your links that I asked for ahead of time. Yeah, you gave me your LinkedIn and your personal site. If people wanted to contact you, how would you prefer that they do it?
yeah, you can contact me. Should I just so my email is just Sharon Lo, SharonLo at github.com. So if you have any questions around Copilot or just in general, I'm happy to chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good weekend.
Thanks, Adam. All right,
Bye,
bye.
Sharon.